say, I know that there's also another side to your story. It's just me. Sorry, you can leave me on the ground. Here, I'll take it to you. Thank you. All right. So as people start to settle back in, I would like to introduce our next panel, which is on Hollywood and Beijing, a very important topic that's not discussed as much as it should be. Our moderator for this, we're very fortunate to have James Kirchick, is a journalist and a foreign correspondent. He's a fellow with the Foreign Policy Initiative and also a correspondent for Daily Beast. His work on domestic politics and American foreign policy has appeared in many global newspapers, including The Washington Post, The New York Times, Britain's Prospect and Spectator, Canada's National Post, and The Australian, and we expect great things. And Jamie, if you'd like to introduce your panel, please feel free.
I'm told by Barry Lynn this is actually the first time there's been a panel on this topic in Washington, so I think it's a really exciting thing to be talking about. Starting on my left, going down, is Ying Zhu, who's professor of media culture at CUNY in New York, and is really the go-to expert on the subject of China and media. Patrick Verone is a TV writer, former president of the Writers Guild of America, and a fellow here at New America, is that correct?
I am a fellow.
Yeah.
I am part of the fellowship.
Ann Kokas is a professor of media studies at University of Virginia and has written a book, Hollywood Made in China, about U.S. media investment in China. And finally, Robert Kane, who is a film producer and media consultant who focuses on U.S.-China co-productions. So before turning it over to our panel, I'd just like to make a few introductory comments. As a film goer, I have begun to see the influence of China in our film industry here in the United States. There are innocent and more insidious examples of this. I think the innocent example might be, say, The Martian, the huge blockbuster hit of last year, which the filmmakers consciously inserted into the script the Chinese Space Agency playing a very positive, productive, cooperative role, and that was clearly done to make this film more profitable in China. And then the more insidious examples, you can see Red Dawn, which was the remake of one of my favorite Cold War movies from the 1980s, where the enemy was supposed to be China invading the United States, and then realizing that this would not sell many tickets in the second biggest movie-going country in the world, they changed it to the slightly less realistic North Koreans invading the United States. But there are many other examples of this that we're going to talk about today. So I'm going to turn it over to our panel. Go ahead.
I think I'm going to go first.
Yeah.
So I'm kind of working on a book project. It's in the past couple of years that looks back at a real century-long relationship between Hollywood and China. And the book is tentatively titled Film as Soft Power and Hard Currency. The subheading is The Sino-Hollywood Courtship, and I'll explain the usage of my term later on. But some of the observations, I kind of come up with during the process of research for the book, and I thought it's pertinent to, in particular, in relation to the dynamic between state and the film industry, and are pertinent to our panel discussion here. So I would kind of take a few minutes to really set these things up. So for those of you who might or might not know, Hollywood really dominated the film market in China during the Republican era that ran from 1912 to 1949, and it has dominated again since 1995 when it was allowed back after a ban enacted in 1950 partly as a result of the Korean War. And the two eras are vastly different, obviously with the contours of the world and the international balance of power radically altered in between, as China's rapid economic growth in recent years nurtured its ambition to compete for market share and also cultural influence. And in my research, I kind of juxtaposed the context and also the terms of Hollywood's Chinese Republican era triumph with those of its repeat performance in the post-1995 China to tease out kind of the similarities and also variations that might not appear in the standard historical accounts of political and ideological contests, international economic competition, and global expansion of local media corporations, and Chinese and American. And the shifting Sino-Hollywood relationship serves as a prism through which and kind of an ongoing, evolving Sino-US power dynamic can be grasped. And speaking of power, and while political, military, and economic power can be measured in terms of strength of leadership, might of armed forces, growth of GDP, etc., and also abundance of strategic or natural resources, cultural power, the so-called, we use this term soft power, is frequently manifested through attractive media products that groups, nations, regions, and other forms of networks showcase to influence the world, right? And the cultural influence of the US in particular has been attributed to the popularity of Hollywood films around the globe. And I know that I hope we've kind of passed out some slides. And if you wanted to turn to slide 1, I have some kind of a few informations passed along slide 1. China has diligently embraced the notion of soft power in its campaign to win the hearts and minds of the world by aggressively tapping cinema, Hollywood and Chinese, to push its agenda. If you want to turn to slide 2, there's some statistics that's interesting. So at the same time, Chinese cinema has become a hot topic in recent years for its expanding market. The most recent example is, Hollywood studios, of course, have taken notice as the market confers power. The most recent example is Warcraft, right? It's a domestic flop, but it's a hugely popular in China. So it helped Hollywood studios to recuperate its investment. So we're at this point that the power of the Chinese market to make or break film is so great that a sequel to Warcraft could conceivably be made solely for the Chinese market, right? So now here's an interesting quote. So Jackie Chan, you know who Jackie Chan is, the flamboyant martial arts an actor, summed up well the cultural influence of an ever-expanding Chinese market. So he said, Warcraft made 600 million yuan in 2 days. This has scared the Americans. If we can make a film that earns 10 billion yuan, then people from all over the world who wants to study film will learn Chinese instead of us having to learn English, unquote. Now back to my book title. I wanted to explain to you a little bit. So the term Sino-Hollywood, in my usage, as opposed to kind of a Sino-American, points to differences and similarities in the way that American and Chinese film industries have historically related to their host governments and to the way that Hollywood has gradually actually become less and less determinedly American. If you go to slide 3, there's a very interesting quote there. Someone claimed that, a seasoned filmmaker claimed that nowadays we no longer make American films and Chinese films, we make global films. So, Hollywood has now become more of a clearinghouse for international financial, organizational, promotional, and creative agent talent gathered together under the rubric of global cinema, right? Although the scale, nature, and regulatory regime differ, a symbiotic relationship between state and film industry exists both in China and in the US. If you want to indulge me to go to slide 4, I have no idea whether these are passed out or not. Slide 4. In the US, the cross-fertilization between the state and the motion picture industry is well documented. Beginning in 1943, Will Hayes and other film executives met from time to time with the State and Commerce Department officials to ensure a free film market abroad after the war, a request that was explicitly linked with the importance of freedom of expression everywhere in the world, quote unquote. And Eric Johnson, the head of MPPDA, appointed in 1945, repeatedly reminded the US government of the importance of the movies in carrying to the world the American message of democracy and free market, right? and others chimed in as well. There's a quote by the president of 20th Century Fox in slide 6, which is kind of interesting quote. If you have it, have a look. Now, so the cross-fertilization between government and industry was obviously apparent, prevalent indeed in China as well during both the Republican era and now. And the Republican era witnessed repeated calls from Chinese film production companies for the Chinese government to impose quotas on foreign imports in the name of patriotism in nation building, right? During the era, Hollywood's share in profits usually ranged from 30% to 70% of the box office receipts and took up actually up to 80% of the Chinese market. And the re-entrance of Hollywood to China in 1994 generated huge revenue, amounting to 70 to 80% of the total box office. Again, it's quickly returned to the same game, which soon evoked the same resistance in China, and thus a new round of protective measures in the form of revenue-sharing formulas. And it's interesting, and I was approached by a journalist from Wall Street Journal who told me that there's an article coming out about how the Chinese side is pressuring the studios to really feature film Chinese stars in real significant roles, right? It's kind of interesting. So meanwhile, on the other side of the story, bolstered by a huge financial muscle and expanding domestic market, there has been more combative posturing within China about building a militant Chinawood or the Bollywood, a Hollywood, a Chinawood, whatever, as an alternative to Hollywood. And the kind of bullish talk has led the expansion of Chinese film industry into Hollywood, which led to another thing that, on the slide, there's a Hollywood invasion of Wang Jianling, right? And the Chinese have come to Hollywood, with Wang Group acquiring AMC theaters and legendary entertainment, the company that has credits to Godzilla and Pacific Rim and so on and so forth, and also the talk is in to buy up Carmike Cinema, et cetera, right? Making really the Chinese firm Wanda a vertically integrated operation, something that the US did away with in a landmark 1948 antitrust suit against Paramount Pictures, right? But now you have a vertically integrated Chinese firm coming in. That's interesting. Now, following Wanda's suit, there's another Chinese media firm, it's called Tang Media Partners, created by a businessman, Donald Tang, and backed by Chinese internet firm Tencent, brought IM Global, a Hollywood film financer and sales agency. Tang believes that rising demand for Chinese-themed content will result in 2 of the 6 major US studios being Chinese-owned within 10 years. That's his prediction. And in some ways, this is business as usual in the age of global mergers and acquisitions, only that the Chinese firms are playing an increasingly prominent role in this age in 2010s, replacing the Japanese in the late 1980s and the Koreans in the late 1990s. So now what about soft power, right? The financial muscle Wanda brings has yet to translate into imaginative and exportable pictures for the Chinese picture, for film. China has yet to climb the cinematic food chain in terms of prestige and popular appeal. And China is looking to Hollywood for help. And for those of you who wanted to entertain slide number 10, there's a quote from the former President Hu Jintao. The Chinese leaders have noted a dismal record of Chinese soft power, telling the party that the overall strength of Chinese culture and its international influence is not commensurate with China's international with international status, end quote. So there are more quotes on slide 11 from Hu Jintao. So reminiscent of Cold War rhetoric, if you read these quotes, this sort of militant talk has only intensified during the Xi Jinping era. Right? The battle against the Western popular culture is equated with ensuring China's cultural security. And to be fair, the West has harbored a similar apprehension and distrust towards China. I suppose the feeling is somewhat mutual here. To wrap it up, as we assess kind of the ramifications of Hollywood's dealing with China, it helps really to see the Sino-Hollywood courtship as a case of political, cultural, and economic rivalry, and also coopetition on a global scale. Given that China continues to suffer the so-called soft power deficiency, and Hollywood is is now tasked with perhaps carrying the torch for the Chinese, because Hollywood films continues to be popular globally, right? So you want to go back to slide 5, there's another interesting kind of a quote there. And historically, Hollywood has always paid attention to what the audience wants. To counter complaints about stereotyping foreigners and other unacceptable foreign contents, the MPAA set up the International Information Center in 1947 to catch unfortunate representations of the US or of foreign content, of foreign nations, before films actually got past the script stage, right? Once upon a time, that's the case. And in short, the bottom line is Hollywood is in the business of entertaining, not necessarily enlightening or certainly not offending, right? This kind of commercial interests frequently override or complicate political and ideological posturing on both the US and China sides. And now film serves constantly as a battlefield for political and cultural influence, Chinese and all American. If you go to the last slide I have, we have a quote from Comrade Stalin there, slide 12. So as Joseph Stalin once remarked, if I could control the medium of the American motion picture, I would need nothing else to convert the entire world to communism. That's his quote. I'm very quickly wrap it up. Okay, one more minute. Now, I use this term courtship to suggest a kind of fitful relationship that, however tentative and antagonistic at times, has brought two willing partners to the table in their common pursuit of prosperity and happiness, which are measurable at best by the size of box office receipts and the less tangible, the notion of soft power. So ultimately, the story of a Sino-Hollywood courtship is one about competing cultural and capital values and developmental models, as well as nationalism and exceptionalism, the so-called cultural supremacy, American and Chinese, and about the shifting global power dynamic playing out in the art and artifice of filmmaking, distribution and exhibition, the kind of grand negotiation between capitals and capitalists. And you know, there's a couple of other additional thoughts I might want to share, but I know it's too much already, so
Patrick.
pass it on to the...
We discussed this amongst ourselves. I'm yielding my time to my colleague from Los Angeles. Rob, why don't you go next?
Okay. Yes, I'm here as a producer, and I've both in Hollywood and in China, and a consultant. I work with Chinese companies and American companies, helping them to raise money, find partnerships, do their business across the Pacific. So it would be very unwise of me to bite the hand that feeds me. But I've been doing it for years, so what the heck. And they the Chinese keep renewing my visa, much to my delight and surprise. But so I'm going to go ahead. What I'd like to address is the issue of censorship and the First Amendment and what's happening to those things in Hollywood, owing to China's increasing influence and even ownership of production and distribution of Hollywood movies. I see this as, I'm very concerned. It's an extremely lopsided trade relationship that we have between the entertainment industries in China and the US. The Chinese, there are certain restrictions to what they can do in the United States in terms of investing, producing, distributing, but they're very limited. You know, really, they can't own a major broadcast network. That's a restriction that applies to any foreign entity. But aside from that, they can do pretty much what they want to do, and they've invested tens of billions of dollars in the last few years and have a great deal of control. On the other hand, Americans or anyone else wanting to do business in entertainment in China, there's almost nothing you can do that unless it's got the authorization of the Chinese Communist Party and the government, and your activities are in line with the desires of the party. What's happened is we've got China with its interest in spreading its own values, the Chinese values, and its soft power, and having a creeping and I would say rapidly expanding influence over what gets made in Hollywood, what movies get made, what subjects get addressed, what can and can't be said in a film. This goes back, you know, the beginning of the modern relationship between China and Hollywood. I really put the marker at 2001 when China signed the WTO, and along with that made certain commitments to allowing trade, and particularly Hollywood trade, to take place in China, and likewise there would be an opportunity for China to participate in other countries around the world. There were two main, really the most important obligations that China committed to at the time were that they would allow foreign entities to import films into China, films, television, and other forms of entertainment, and also that foreign entities would be allowed to own the means of distribution and could distribute themselves in China. That was 2001. A couple of months after that was signed, the then Prime Minister Zhu Rongji made a statement. It wasn't directly related to the WTO, but I know this was very much on his mind when he said this: Western hostile forces are continuing to promote their strategy of westernizing and breaking up our country. And he accused these people, he didn't name specifically who he had in mind, but he said he accused them of conducting infiltration and sabotage. Now, in the context of the speech, and you can go back and look at it in other speeches he made, you can infer that he was talking about, mainly about the United States, and he might as well have been pointing his finger at Hollywood. In the 15 years since, I have to say this is about the nicest thing I've seen a Chinese Communist Party bureaucrat say about Hollywood. It's gotten much worse. They despise Hollywood. They despise the values that it promotes, things like independence, democracy, you know, and the right to self-rule, I guess. So they had a 10-year timeline to drop the monopolization, basically, of import and distribution in China. 10 years passed, they had done nothing. 2 more years passed. The MPAA and the U.S. Trade Representative pushed Xi Jinping before he became president, but it was right before, when he was visiting Los Angeles, and Joe Biden got him into a room, and what I heard was basically twisted his arm and said, there has to be some concession here. And he got some concession. It was not a half measure. I would say it was about 1/10 of what really China should have done if it were going to honor its commitments. They basically increased the very strict quota of a number of films that were allowed into the country, and slightly increased the amount of money that Hollywood films could earn from distribution in China. Still very much under the control of the Chinese government, though, and the monopoly remains. No one else, it's really the Chinese Communist Party that decides what films can come into the country, what scripts can be approved, what gets produced, what gets financed. It's all under the control of the government. And I don't see that changing, actually. China doesn't want to change it, and we don't seem to have the political will here or in the rest of the world to force them to change that. On the other hand, Hollywood, you know, China's film market has grown tremendously. It's in the 15 years since 2001, I think it was about, if I remember correctly, about $150 million a year business. It's going to approach $8 billion a year. That's just theatrical film revenue. And of course, if you add television and internet content, it's tens of billions of dollars. Hollywood has been allowed to import films into China through a state-owned enterprise, China Film Group, and another company that's also really effectively owned by the state. And they have created a lot of value. Chinese audiences love Hollywood movies and TV, but the producers, the creators of that content, really retain only a small fraction of the value they create. I would say it's well under 20% of the retail value comes back to the producers. Think of it in the rest of the world more like 40 or 50%. The amount of investment that has taken place from the U.S. into China has been very limited, basically because the government doesn't really allow very much. On the other hand, we have a very open border here and an open market. There have been, I'm not going to run through the whole list, but I did compile a list of just recent investments. Dalian Wanda Group, I'm sure many of you have heard about their investment, their acquisition of AMC Theaters in 2012 for $2.6 billion. They also have an acquisition of Carmike Cinemas. They're now the largest theater exhibitor in the United States and in the world. Wanda Group also acquired Legendary Entertainment for $3.5 billion. Ying mentioned Tencent's acquisition of IM Global, one of the very big players, US-based players in international distribution and finance of films and television. Dick Cook, the former chairman of Disney Motion Picture Group, has raised $150 million from CITIC, one of the big wealth funds in China, and another $500 million from a company called Film Carnival in China. Perfect World just recently closed a deal. They're financing a quarter of Universal Pictures' slate. They invested $500 million. And if you go see Bridget Jones's Baby, you'll see Perfect World's logo very prominently displayed. Bona Group owns a piece of Fox. Hunan TV owns a big piece of Lionsgate's film and television production. A new company, STX, is funded almost entirely by companies like Hunan TV, Huayi Brothers, Hony Capital. Most of the movies that company is making, and they're a big force, are being financed by Chinese money. Now, what's the impact of all of this? All of these, and there are more, I could keep going, but all of these investments from Chinese companies can be seen as really as investments by the Chinese Communist Party. Even though the party doesn't directly invest that money, they're authorizing every single one of these investments, and if they don't authorize them, they don't happen. And in many cases also they're providing some of the capital, in some cases all of the capital that goes into these deals. And what they get is some pretty major strings that go along with these investments. These companies, and I would say it's now pervasive across Hollywood, cannot make a film that contravenes any of China's major censorship restrictions, and especially the most important ones are expressing ideas that are seen as threatening to the Communist Party, to China, to the people of China. And in most cases, I would say, you know, that's not necessarily something you would want to do all the time, but you know, we've given up that right completely. You will never see another Chinese villain in an American movie. And I think that's unfortunate. There are, despite what the government would tell you and their censorship would tell you, not everybody there is a terrific person. Not everything that happens there is, you know, it's not a utopia. The police don't always get their man. Some of them are actually corrupt. Bad things happen in China as everywhere else. But you just simply will not see that in a Chinese movie. You won't see that in a Hollywood movie. And I happen to think China could be a great villain. You know, we used to pick on Russia and the Soviet Union. China is, let's just say there are, you know, some things they do that may be objectionable to the American way of life. I would be very interested to see a movie called South China Sea, for instance. And I think that could be a terrific action-adventure movie or a thriller or something. No one's even going to bring up that idea. In fact, if any of us were to pitch that to the Hollywood studios, we'd be immediately blacklisted and never be allowed to enter any of the studio gates again.
Well, good luck getting that visa again, China.
Thank you. Yes, I guess I better stop now before I go too far.
So now from the view within Hollywood.
Well, yeah, let me continue the hand biting. Simply, first of all, let me thank New America for scheduling this following or during lunch so that everyone is nice and sleepy while we attempt to inform you. So I'm going to throw three cliches at you from the Hollywood creative perspective. The first is attributable to William Goldman, who wrote the screenplay of all the President's Men, particularly appropriate to this town, which is nobody knows anything. Now, that's the greatest cop-out anybody on a panel about any subject could ever give, and so I'm leading with that. The Hollywood community is probably unlike most in that although a lot of industries, nobody knows anything there either, but at least we're willing to admit that. I'm what we call in the business a working writer, which means I'm mostly unemployed. And during my last batch of unemployment, I've mostly been a working television writer in my career, but I spent my last batch of unemployment trying to sell a feature film. And there were two experiences that I got almost immediately. And historically, the way you sell a feature film in Hollywood has been you go into one of the studios, or as many of the studios as will let you in, and they'll say, you say, have I got an idea for you? And it's almost like trying to sell a car idea to Ford. It's a little easier than that, but not much. And if you couldn't sell it there, maybe you'd try to get some independent producer to make it. Well, now, and the idea that we've been selling is an animated film. I've spent a lot of my television career in animation. And so trying to sell an animated film without going to Disney or DreamWorks or even Universal now is a very much uphill battle. But everywhere that we've gone, the first thing that they've told us is there's a lot of Chinese money out there. You got to be able to do something that will appeal to the Chinese market. And then the second thing they tell you is, and by the way, the deal will fall through. So here we are out trying to pitch an idea that's inevitably never going to be made, which is, of course, par for the course in Hollywood. But I'll give you a couple of anecdotes that are appropriate to that. A colleague of mine, also an important animation writer in Hollywood, which puts him really low on the totem pole, but was flown to China by a man he described as the Walt Disney of China, who owns theme parks, one of the wealthiest people in China, and who happens to have he owns the only 3 panda triplets born in captivity. And of course, he wanted to make a TV, an animated feature film about these 3 pandas. So he flew my colleague to China, and it was brokered by a Chinese journalist who assured my friend that this guy was legit and that this was going to happen, but be careful because all these deals fall through, and this guy is particularly slippery. So after they had this meeting, and the meeting included the Chinese Walt Disney saying to my friend, you got to start tonight. Before you even get on the plane, I want you to write this movie for me, which is an indication of just how little he knew about how the process works. And so when my colleague returned to the States, he then, it looked like a deal was being made. His agent was contacted. There were papers passing across the oceans, and the journalist who had set up the deal was in communication with him by email. My friend said, yeah, well, it looks like it went very well. I'm sorry that you thought this guy was so slippery. She took that email and she forwarded it to the producer, which I don't know if that's the way things are done in China or not, but they're not the way we do things here. And of course, the deal fell through. I'll skip ahead through some of the other anecdotes, other than to say I actually had the privilege of being represented by Resolution, which was the talent agency funded by the Bison Capital Group, and which, of course, fell through. So I now have a working agent as well as being a working writer. The other cliche that I'll also attribute to William Goldman is follow the money, or the more cinematic show me the money. And it would certainly appear that the history of Hollywood is one of very tepid, reactionary response to social and political and financial trends, and then jumping in with both feet. And so it would seem that over the next, well, we've heard from Rob the ever-growing list of deals being made. You're hearing from me the uncitable list of deals that aren't being made. But my sense is that the way the French, the way the Japanese, the way even the Canadians tried to come to Hollywood with big bags of money and change Hollywood and make it their own, my suspicion is that the same will happen here, that the money will come here, there, to Hollywood, that there will be there is this influx of Chinese money, and China will get bitten by the Hollywood bug. Totalitarian regimes are probably a little bit different than what the French and the Canadian and the Japanese experience was, and we're fond of saying, this isn't one of the cliches, but we're fond of saying that everything is always the same unless it isn't. And so maybe China will be different. But at this point, there is a real similarity between the way the money is coming in and whether or not it actually changes the way Hollywood does business. And that actually dovetails into my third cliche, which is the more things change, the more they stay the same. Because in fact, Hollywood is the thing that's changing right now. And the not only technologically, financially, socially, the way things are done in Hollywood on the creative end, the distribution, and the exhibition end is changing in most extraordinary ways. To wit, every 20 years or so, there's some major technological change that one technology displaces the old, a new one displaces the old one, and everyone says, okay, well, that's the end of the old way of doing business. And inevitably what happens is the old way of doing business figures out a way to adapt. And it's like the line from Jurassic Park, you know, it'll figure out how to adapt. And so what I sense happening to a certain extent is that the movie industry, and this goes to what Chris Gopal said in the last panel, that it's not like the movie industry is a hive mind. It's not like you've got, even though you've only got 5 or 6 multinational single conglomerates that control media in this country and possibly soon the world, they do still operate as competitors, and they operate with individual agendas. I wonder if, because I happen to know that the movie industry is a very, very profitable industry, but they've also, these are big diversified companies that have this whole thing called television over here. That's about anywhere from 2 to 4 times larger, depending on which conglomerate you're talking about, much more profitable than movies. And so here they are trying to sell this bill of goods to China that, and I'll speak lowly that way, as though the people don't get the wrong idea, that I'm trying to give away the farm here. But there's this whole other television marketplace that's out there that isn't being paid much attention to. And I understand movies are a lot more glamorous. You know, it's like the kid who sweeps up after the elephant at the circus. Why do you do it? What, and leave show business? I mean, people want to be in the movies. And yet in television, I can again see that there might be problems with the immediacy of television. Movies are a much more controllable entity. But I just have the sense that over time, the convergence between television and film, which is already changing Hollywood in very dramatic ways, one word, Netflix, is also going to impact the way that China reacts and China develops its feature film industry. And apropos of Netflix, by the way, and the convergence of TV and film, just to point out, the first thing that Netflix made when they made a feature film was Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon 2, which they made in conjunction with the China Media Group and in complete review by the Chinese government. So for me, it's a case of will China get bitten by the Hollywood bug, or will they be the first entity that can actually change the way we do business, which of course is following the money? My assumption is that all of these answers, even though nobody knows anything, many of the answers will be answered tonight on the season finale of Mr. Robot.
Thank you. Anne.
Oh, well, thank you to Barry and to New America and to all of these amazing panelists. I've already learned so much and have also had a really fun time being able to talk about this stuff. Also, thanks to Patrick for kind of leading into this discussion about television and digital distribution. And I think that this is a really important part of the picture. So in my book, Hollywood Made in China, I look at all of the different ways that Hollywood exports branded media content to China. So everything from Disney English schools to theme parks to films to attempts at exporting television and digital content, which, as I'll talk about here, are much more difficult to do than in the context of film. As Rob very helpfully articulated, that's already not an easy business to be a part of. So the Chinese film import quota currently allows only 34 films to enter the Chinese market. That's also due for renegotiation in February of 2017. But in the context of digital distribution, this is an even more complicated picture. And I'm going to focus on this because I think it's a relevant area for the previous panel as well, when we're thinking about these questions of technology companies and of cybersecurity issues and the fiduciary responsibilities of technology companies when they're doing business with China. So now I'm going to throw out a couple of numbers here, just because I think that it's helpful to think about the context of the film industry in relation to the digital distribution industry. So last year, in 2015, the Chinese market was $6.8 billion. The Chinese theatrical distribution market was $6.8 billion, according to the Motion Picture Association of America. Now, at the same time, during the same year, China had an estimated 688 million total internet users. And of those, an estimated 433 million used online video. Now, if we do the numbers here, the Chinese box office is 6.8 billion. Now, if content producers can monetize a total of $16 per year, or roughly 9 yuan per person per month, then online video can be monetized at a higher rate than film. Now, whereas there are 34 import slots for global films in the Chinese market, it's a very different picture for digital distribution platforms in China. And one of the things that we see is, I mean, so Patrick very aptly brought up this question of Netflix, which is predicating their global growth predicating their industrial growth on global expansion. But 2 days ago, we just had an announcement from Reed Hastings, the CEO of Netflix, articulating the fact that they have been unsuccessful in getting licensing in China, despite going through the process of producing a co-production that was very much geared toward the Chinese market. That was distributed theatrically, not digitally. Similarly, or not in the legal digital market. So, and that's just one thing to bring up as well. So when I'm talking about these companies not being able to access the Chinese market, it's that they aren't accessing it legally. 20% of those 600, or an estimated 28% of those 688 million internet users also use virtual private networks or proxy servers to go over the Great Wall of China. So once that happens, once you kind of move beyond the structure of internet censorship, then access to Hulu, access to Netflix, access to Amazon Video is a very different game. However, those companies don't have the opportunity to really recuperate that revenue in the same way. So if we look at the growth of Chinese competitors in that market, iQIYI, Youku, and the kind of lack of success that even major American competitors have been able to have, Hulu, Netflix, Amazon Video, YouTube. I mean, this is the kind of the laundry list of companies that have not been able to successfully enter the Chinese market, but are rapidly growing American firms. So this really presents us with an interesting quandary about what the future of the media industries will look like, what the future of distribution will look like. So when we're looking at questions like television and the growth of American television, which is having this really exciting renaissance in terms of the types of content that's being produced, most of the way that we consume our TV is now online. I know I do, and I'm guessing most of the people in this room do. So when we're in a situation where in China those distribution platforms are not, those American distribution platforms are not readily available in violation of WTO protocol, as Rob pointed out, then we have a very complicated competitive landscape. There are some other trade issues and cybersecurity issues that I'd like to highlight here as well. So when we're thinking about companies like Netflix, companies like Hulu, companies like Amazon Video, companies like YouTube, they are very excited and about entering the Chinese market for very clear reasons. However, they're not just entertainment companies, they're also data companies. So when we're thinking about these questions of cybersecurity and the fiduciary responsibilities that American companies have for maintaining cybersecurity protections, these are companies that we also need to take a look at as they're trying to work through their China market entry strategy. So I just wanted to kind of highlight that as a connection between this panel and that panel to think about, even though Hollywood is, it's fun and and there's all this entertainment content. Ultimately, there are also these kind of trade and security issues that are very closely imbricated with the expansion of Silicon Valley and Hollywood companies that are technology focused into the Chinese market. Let's see. Yeah, and I guess the main thing, we've been kind of talking about whether or not we believe that Hollywood will change or China will change, and how this will ultimately happen. But I think what we'll see is an increasing relationship, an increasingly close relationship. But as China's theatrical distribution market becomes the largest in the world, which it is projected to do between 2017 and 2020, depending on how quickly the market grows, I think we'll increasingly see Hollywood made for China, as well as Hollywood made in China. So, thank you very much.
Great. We only have about 10 minutes left, so I thought maybe we can just go straight to questions in the audience. There is a microphone going around, I think. The gentleman over there in the red tie. Appropriately colored tie for the afternoon.
Thank you. Dana Marshall, Transnational Strategy Group. This is a really terrific panel, especially for those of us that live in the 202 area code, because we don't have the opportunity to really understand the way the industry is structured, the legal issues and all of that. So let me pick up on that. I guess, and maybe to combine it with sort of the raw political questions that we sort of do handle in this town. If we were to strip this issue down to its bare bones essentials, I guess when we have, let's say, the next negotiation with China, maybe it's not Joe Biden having a cup of tea with them, but somebody, perhaps it could be a little tougher negotiator. What is it that we should be, in the view of the panel, what should we be trying to get from the Chinese to accomplish at least two objectives, right? One is to make sure that that if the American public is propagandized, that there's a statement that says this information is being provided on behalf of a foreign sovereign government, which has to be done if any of the firms in this room represent a foreign government. There has to be a statement made that this represents the views of a foreign sovereign government. So that's one issue. And the second issue is on the economics, to make sure that we can get a better deal for American companies. Should we be using more reciprocal access and that sort of thing?
Whoever wants to take that, go ahead.
Well, look, I'm about as far removed from policy as can be, so I may sound very naive about this, but it's my strong feeling that Washington needs to step in very decisively. This is entertainment is one of our most important export industries, and far beyond that, when we talk about soft power, hearts and mind, expressing our values around the world, it's a critically important industry. Hollywood can't really be relied upon to take the necessary actions. It's not doing a good job of defending itself, and so I do think the USTR and together with the MPAA really needs to take a much stronger leadership role in getting China to loosen up, to abide by their commitments, and also, as you say, to help identify these issues of Chinese companies and really, as I said, the Chinese Communist Party taking a major ownership role in our media.
And I'd like to build off of what Jen Harris discussed earlier today about this question of actually looking at financial regulation as a strategy for doing this. So, I mean, one in terms of this trade imbalance, at least in terms of digital distribution. I mean, the SEC and the SEC really could have in the past had a really big impact on that, in the sense that most of the major Chinese internet companies have been listed on the NASDAQ or the New York Stock Exchange. So Wall Street is really bankrolling, and the U.S. capital and global capital markets based in New York are really bankrolling the growth of a lot of these companies. Which isn't to say that that we need to take a step back from our role in the global market, but it is to say that we should think about what the implications are of this, particularly when there's absolutely no trade reciprocity in this particular area.
And let me just point out, I mean, the big issue for years, of course, has been copyright protection, and I say that not as a representative of the Motion Picture Association, which of course I'm not, but in fact as a bargaining partner, as a former president of the Writers Guild, we make a quarter of our revenue as creative community on our residuals, and the failure of the companies that employ us and collect those residuals to get earnings from distribution of the material that they release in China affects all of us. I mean, it is the true trickle-down economics that has an impact on our industry. Beyond that, I don't know that labeling or that putting a made in China on the products on the properties would necessarily make a difference so much as you know, what did Brandeis say? The answer to bad speech is more speech, and I have a feeling Hollywood is just going to continue to turn stuff out, even if there is you know, material that has some level of Chinese or any outside censorship to it. There's still going to be, in this country at least, material that's independent of that.
Just very briefly, you know, I think, you know, my fellow panelists have put you know, make a couple of a few very concrete suggestions, and Patrick talked about, you know, this is business as usual. It's hard to change. And as a film historian, I just wanted to say, you can look back at the kind of very symbiotic relationship between the U.S. State and the Commerce Department and the film industry in the interwar era and during the war. And just go back and look, and you probably can learn some lessons from there and see in what way the government can facilitate and you know, certain or direct a certain kind of a trajectory of the development of the industry.
I think we have time for one more question, or? Oh, go, please, go ahead.
I don't know if you guys have looked at the billboard over your shoulders. And I guess the question I wanted to put to you all is sort of, you know, here we are with Donald Trump running for president. You know, we're in a very different sort of political environment than we've been in this country in a long time. It's true in Europe as well. We see this kind of resurgent nationalism. And I guess I'm wondering if, you know, is anyone in Hollywood really talking about the danger that, you know, under it says China's red puppet, it just says, sort of AMC theaters, it says Hollywood. And whether in the near term we might actually kind of see this become a major political issue, you know, in which we kind of have kind of McCarthyite interactions between Washington and Hollywood.
I hope not.
Yeah.
So I had to testify before the Senate Commerce Committee about 5 years ago on the issue of net neutrality, and I was the first Writers Guild president not to be let out of a U.S. congressional committee in handcuffs for not naming names.
Yeah.
And so, you know, we at the Writers Guild in particular are very sensitive to, you know, that kind of accusation. I mean, again, it goes to the idea that here, you know, among other things, that the AMC Theater and the ownership of the theater chain, and Rob pointed out that Dailang Wanda is now the biggest theater distribution operation in the United States. You know, they're the people who make it's like saying the people who make the cups that you drink your water out of are influencing what you know, there's fluoride in the water. I think this is a bank shot,
Yeah.
and that I'm less concerned about that than I am about, you know, Chinese investment in the actual production of the content.
Yeah, I'm inclined to echo what Patrick says. I think that there's a lot that can be done from a financial, from an open markets perspective, from an anti-monopoly perspective, in terms of regulating corporate ownership structures, in terms of regulating investment, in the way that we do in a lot of other industries. I mean, the way that we protect the coal industry is you know, it's, even though the way that we protect the coal industry is very different than how we protect the motion picture industry. And I mean, it's worth looking at how those policies operate in concert and in conflict with one another. So essentially, I think we need to start treating Hollywood much like another global industry, in the United States that we want to protect. And previously it hasn't needed that protection because it's been such a globally dominant force without any kind of visible future competitor. So I think we need to also think about how we reframe this debate about the regulatory relationship between Washington and Hollywood.
Sir.
Thank you. It is a very interesting topic. How's the movie in China? I teach in university. Every day I have, with the young, students to talk about. So we China are worried about the U.S. own China for many years. Like here, China owns U.S. You are worried about China will own United States. But China, they will worry about it for 20 years, about the U.S. kind of own China because the Chinese young generation prefer the U.S. movie, U.S. living style, U.S. Christmas Day, even the Chinese Spring Festival. So China worries so much than U.S., But I'm usually here, I see, in the morning I listen about the battle in the politics, in security, in the economics. Now we're talking about the cultural battle, I'm really curious, how you worry about so much, we have living in such a fear for many years, So the question particularly to Professor Zhu Ying, I think is particularly, you are mainly from China, I think, maybe connected with China, I think. You're doing more about China studies, I think. So I think it's connected with your research. You talk about the soft power and how the Communist Party do that. And particularly here is the China red puppet. You already labeled, you are talking about labeled with Communist Party. I'm talking about this, here is moving more about markets. I prefer it though. If you think about the China red puppets, how about the Chinese young generation, our Chinese governments and my children? Chinese parents are worried about the American puppet in China. So it's really, we have to think about this. If we think of all this, everywhere we are doing confrontation, we are doing our this kind of struggle and battle. Really, China, I don't think is think of such a long-term. The Chinese young generation doing very short-term, objective. So
is there a question?
Yes, my question. So how do you think is will continue to do this battle?
I think, I mentioned, I don't know precisely what the question is, but I try to gather. But I think it's mutual. The kind of apprehension, the fear of each other is mutual at this point. This kind of militant rhetoric people uses from the Chinese side. If you read the slide, the slide is not up, and I think Robert quoted some of the quite militant statement made by the Chinese leaders, talking about the Western infiltration of Western ideas and so on and so forth. I think the fear, of course, is real. And what we're discussing here, I think, is a kind of both economic issues, trade issues, and also and the ramifications of these issues, which has to do with ideology and culture and politics. And earlier, the first panel, Orwell talked about, the real roadblock. They were talking about convergence is, we have fundamentally different value system, political systems. How do we come together, right? So, and this gets back to the same issue. Leads back to the same issue. So film, yes, it's a trade. We talk about box office and trade and so on and so forth, but film also carries certain cultural values, undeniably cultural values. So again, how do we really reconcile these issues?
Unfortunately, that's all the time we have. This is a fascinating topic. We could go all afternoon, but thank you to the panel. Thank you very much.
Actually, if we can get the next panel up here so we can stay on time.
different contents of the distribution. They have companies have signed deals with Chinese